Alliance. I'm the Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation. But I do want to give a quick shout out to my colleague in the back, Maritza. If you could raise your hand. Maritza is the Director of Federal Affairs with the Drug Policy Alliance. And so when I transitioned back to the Drug Policy Alliance and started to try and figure out what the hell is going on at the federal level, Marissa has kind of schoolhouse rocked me this entire process. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in general, there's expertise across the room. And really just want to say thank you to my colleague Marissa, because it's through our work that we do at the federal level that I've been able to develop this expertise, particularly on federal marijuana rescheduling, but also on lots of the legislation that's been introduced in this Congress. And so what I'm hoping to be able to do for this session is to give you all a federal update. It's going to focus on two things primarily. First, federal marijuana rescheduling, and then second, what legislation has been introduced in the 119th Congress. Because my colleague is in the room, or if I say anything inaccurate, feel free to fact check me in real time. We'll otherwise get started, and I'll try and finish with enough time so that we can get into conversation as well. All right, so federal marijuana rescheduling. I'm actually going to stand up. It's easier for me to look at the screen while I'm standing. I don't know if that's affecting the camera situation, but we can resolve that. But we know that this federal marijuana rescheduling effort started under the Biden administration when in 2022 we had President Biden at the time issuing a statement instructing the Department of Health and Human Services and his Attorney General to review expeditiously how marijuana was scheduled under federal law. And this process has continued to date, so I'm hoping to walk you all not only through the timeline of what's happened as far to date, but also what it would mean if marijuana were actually to be rescheduled at the federal level, in particular, what it would mean if marijuana was to be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So after this directive from President Biden, about almost a year had passed until we had the next milestone in the process, which was for the first time in history, we had our Department of Health and Human Services actually recommending that marijuana be a Schedule 3 drug. And they made this recommendation to the DEA, and ultimately, when we saw it happening, we were all kind of waiting to see what the DEA's response would be. And later on the next year, in May of 2024, we saw, in true sense, in actuality, the Department of Justice issue a proposed rule that would move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This notice of proposed rulemaking that took place in May of 2024 included a public comment period that lasted 62 days. And in that 62-day public comment period, there were a record number of public comments that were submitted on drug scheduling. More than 43,000 public comments that were submitted total. And this notice of proposed rulemaking not only allowed for folks to submit public comment, but it also included the opportunity for folks to request a public hearing. Some folks did submit that request for a public hearing. It wasn't until later on in 2024 that the DEA announced that there was going to be a hearing on the proposed rulemaking. And that announcement of that hearing included means by which interested parties could request to participate in that hearing. The DEA then selected, I want to say, 25 witnesses that it said were interested parties withstanding to participate in that hearing. And it was around about that time that different legal motions started to be filed and different challenges were raised, in part because of who the DEA had selected to be interested parties in this hearing. Some would say that the DEA chose more individuals who would be supportive of maintaining marijuana on Schedule 1 than moving it to Schedule 3. I'm one of those people. And there were also concerns not only about the selection of the witnesses, but in communication with witnesses. And that the DEA, going back and forth with some folks, allowed some folks to amend their original filing, essentially to kind of get their language right so that they can qualify as an interested party. But some of the folks who were involved in this process filed various legal challenges. Some of them were individuals who were selected as interested parties. And there was an administrative law judge, Ruby, who back at the end of last year, there was at the end of 2024, there was a preliminary hearing that was held where they were originally trying to essentially organize what the hearings were going to be, when they were supposed to take place in January. One of those legal challenges was actually trying to disqualify the DEA from participating in this rulemaking. And some of the concerns that were raised by the folks who had raised this particular motion was that they weren't actually sure that the DEA was supportive of this proposed rule. And there was a concern that if the DEA itself wasn't supportive of this proposed rule, then the hearing itself was not going to be balanced. Ultimately, before this hearing took place that was scheduled for January 21st, 2025, the administrative law judge issued a stay and essentially allowed the interested parties to file an interlocutory appeal. And that's essentially where the process has been to date, and it's kind of holding pattern. With the stay that was granted by the administrative law judge, the administrative law judge was essentially requiring those parties to, both the DEA and the decision maker in this interlocutory appeal, but also the individuals who filed this motion, to give them updates every 6 months. So I believe at this point we've only gotten one 6-month update since January, probably in June sometime. But at that update, both parties said that there was no update because there hadn't been hearings scheduled to determine those related issues. Just as like a point of note for this decision making around whether or not the DEA was fair in selection of witnesses or in communication with witnesses. The administrative law judge was basically kicking things back up to the DEA to decide. So the DEA was to decide whether or not it was fair in its decision making on various witnesses. I got so comfortable, I stuck the clicker in my pocket. All right, so let's talk about what this federal marijuana rescheduling process looks like. Essentially, regardless of what drug we're talking about when it's going through this review process, agencies are looking at 8 specific factors. You'll see them here, I won't read them. But based on these particular factors, agencies are supposed to come up with 3 specific findings. They're trying to figure out what a drug's relative abuse potential is compared to other drugs, whether or not it has a currently accepted medical use in the United States, and its relative safety profile, particularly its ability to produce physical dependence as compared to other drugs. And when HHS did its evaluation for marijuana this time, it found that marijuana should be placed in Schedule 3. Again, as a Schedule 1 drug, marijuana is considered to be a drug that has a high potential for abuse and a drug that does not have a currently accepted use. As a Schedule 3 drug, marijuana would get this new classification, which would mean that the government considers it to be a drug that has a abuse potential that is less than Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, and most importantly, that it is a drug with a currently accepted medical use. But I'll just note that this term, currently accepted medical use, is kind of a term of art that's specifically used in the rescheduling process. In fact, it's such a term of art that for this particular rescheduling process, the HHS redefined what currently accepted medical use means. And in past years, the only way that drugs were able to show that they had a currently accepted medical use is if they had gotten FDA approval or had met the DEA's 5-part test that was basically anomalous to FDA approval. And through this process, at least HHS and DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel has confirmed that this new way, this new test that was used for currently accepted use is also good. They didn't say that the DEA 5-part test was bad, but they said that this new test that HHS used for currently accepted medical use this time was also good. And what's notable about this new test is that it really relies on the fact that there are existing state medical marijuana programs in which states are actually prescribing medical marijuana and kind of using a plain term usage of currently accepted medical use, but highly dependent on the fact that there are these existing state-regulated medical marijuana programs. And part of the kind of logic and thinking here is that while FDA regulates drugs, it's states that actually regulate the practice of medicine. And so it's states, through their own regulated programs, that are determining that there is currently accepted medical use. I mentioned previously this public comment process that was held for this proposed rule. I did want to note that the Drug Policy Alliance did some early analysis of the 43,000 public comments that were submitted, and we found that approximately 70% of the public comments that were submitted not only supported rescheduling, but wanted to see the government go further and actually decriminalize rescheduled cannabis. And 42% of the comments mentioned things like social justice and racial equity, kind of highlighting the gap between what rescheduling would provide, the types of reforms that communities are asking for. This is kind of a toot of my own horn and the DPA's horn. DPA and our coalition that we helped to organize and convene, United for Marijuana Decriminalization, built an API tool to try and help members of the public submit comments directly to the DEA and DOJ for this proposed rulemaking. And we were able to confirm that over 24% of the public comments that were submitted came directly from our API tool. All right, so what would rescheduling marijuana mean? This language is pulled directly from the proposed rule, but I try to remind folks this top piece because folks sometimes I think, well, marijuana is moved to Schedule 3, that it'll be treated like every other Schedule 3 substance. And I try to caution folks that that might not be the case, in part because of this language that's clear on the face of the rule that says if marijuana is moved to Schedule 3, the regulatory controls in Schedule 3 would apply, along with existing marijuana-specific requirements and any additional controls that might be implemented, including those that might be implemented to meet U.S. treaty obligations. And so I've been calling Schedule 3, Schedule 3 plus, which I say this because in practice, marijuana may be on Schedule 3 at some point, but because of these regulatory controls, these additional regulatory controls that agencies have the ability to promulgate rules for, we might in practice be treating marijuana just like we treated it as a Schedule 1 substance. And so I'm very interested to see what the actual handling requirements are that come out. They were missing in the original proposed rule. That was one of the first things I did a keyword search for when the original proposed rule came out. It's like, oh, what are the handling requirements going to be? They didn't include them. And so anticipation for what these handling requirements are actually going to look like if marijuana is moved to Schedule 3. But it's also very clear in the proposed rule that if marijuana were moved to Schedule 3, manufacture, distribution, dispensing, and possession of marijuana will remain subject to applicable criminal prohibitions. And we're not only dealing with the CSA, but also the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which would still apply even if marijuana were to be completely descheduled. And so we're going to be dealing with a situation in which it's still the DEA who is the lead agency responsible for not only registering and making sure that all individuals who are handling marijuana are registered with the DEA, but also enforcing these particular regulations that may be promulgated. So to be clear, rescheduling would not end marijuana arrest. It's not going to release them in prison. It's not going to restore access to public benefits like housing, employment, education, things that are still at risk today because marijuana is in fact illegal at the federal level. It's not going to protect state marijuana programs, not even medical marijuana programs. As I mentioned, it's currently accepted medical use language is a term of art, and even though HHS had to rely on state programs to come up with this finding of currently accepted medical use, those state programs are still illegal under this framework, and there's a marked difference between currently accepted use and FDA approval. And that is what will be necessary for these drugs to be legally marketed in the United States, particularly for interstate commerce, but really legal and accessible via prescription, like we think of other substances that might be on Schedule 3. It's not protecting workers in the industry, nor addressing the issues around equity that we've been talking about. So all of this has been happening with last administration. We're now in a new administration, but what's interesting in part is that during the last election cycle, we saw this current president make a statement on cannabis in general. And so this is what President Trump has said publicly about marijuana since I guess this language was during the presidential election. Just in the last couple of weeks, he was asked by a journalist about the ongoing rescheduling process. And he said lots of things. He said it's good and bad in some circumstances. He definitely said that his administration is looking at it. And I think what caught most folks' attention was that he said that he expected a decision. He looked back at Pam Bondi and tried to confirm, but he said that he expected a decision to come from his administration in the next couple weeks. And so we'll see what that means. I sometimes spend too much time on Twitter, and I know that there's a lot of assumptions that things are going to happen last Friday, or maybe today, or next day. I don't know. When things happen, it will be good for me, for sure. But President Trump said that we'll continue to focus on research on unlocking medical uses of marijuana to a Schedule 3 drug, so maybe this administration will in fact move marijuana to Schedule 3. So what's next? There are a couple of different ways that this can go. The DEA could essentially move to a final rule. There was that ongoing administrative hearing process that was stopped, and who knows what's going on with it now. They could just decide that they don't want to do that anymore. They don't need to actually fool with the witnesses for the hearing. That was completely discretionary for the DEA to decide in the first place. So they decided we don't want to do that. We want to move to a final rule. That would be the quickest way for them to do that. They could also try to move for a new rule of sorts, kind of start the process over. That seems less likely. Or there could be some type of continuation of this existing process where they say, we do want to start back these hearings. Part of the challenge is that the administrative law judge who was overseeing this hearing has since retired. And I don't know what the bench of ALJs looks like today, so we don't exactly know what that looks like, but maybe they'll decide on the fairness of their selection of witnesses or continue on the hearing, maybe they choose new witnesses, but there are a number of different paths that this can go. But that's where we are. with federal marijuana rescheduling, but it seems like something's going to happen soon. So we'll see. Anytime someone says soon, you should slant your eyes. So let's talk a little bit about what's moving with legislation. And I do think that this is really where efforts need to focus, because at the end of the day, even if marijuana is moved to Schedule 3, we're going to need Congress to act in order to actually solve the challenges and problems that our ecosystem is dealing with today. So I'm going to very quickly try to walk you all through some legislation that's been introduced today. These are going to be very short summaries. Just want to give you a topical overview so you got to get a sense of what issues our congressional rules are thinking about. There is the MORE Act, which was most recently introduced. It would fully decriminalize and deschedule cannabis. It would provide for reinvestment into communities that were adversely impacted by the war on drugs. It would provide expungement for certain cannabis offenses. There is a bill called States 2.0 that would not, it wouldn't deschedule marijuana, but it would create a limited exception for marijuana that is state compliant. And I'll put a pause on that for a second, but it would create a narrow exception for state compliant activity while keeping marijuana on the CSA. It would also authorize the FDA to promulgate some product regulations, and it would also enable interstate commerce for jurisdictions that wanted to authorize and enable that interstate commerce. A caveat about this narrow exception based on state compliant activity. What I try to remind folks is that just like the ladies who were on the panel with me earlier, compliance is dynamic. And so you might be compliant in one moment and not compliant the next. And so I'm not necessarily sure how this works in practice, either as a business or as an individual. It's very easy with all of the different regulations that exist at the state and local level for businesses to flow in and out of compliance. And individuals can do the same thing. For example, in Ohio, I have a 2.5 ounce possession limit. If I have 2.51 ounces, now I'm no longer protected and could be subject to the full weight of federal enforcement. But just about States 2.0, there are also bills that have been introduced that are specifically about veterans' access. These bills are similar, but there is the Veterans Cannabis Use for Safe Healing Act. It would prohibit the Department of Veterans Affairs from denying benefits to veterans who participate in state marijuana programs, and it would allow VA doctors to discuss and recommend cannabis in legal states. There's also the Veterans Equal Access Act, which would authorize the Department of Veterans Affairs to provide these recommendations and options to participate in these state marijuana programs. There are a number of bills that have been introduced related to this rescheduling. So there was a bill introduced earlier this summer that would essentially effectuate, well, rescheduling would effectuate, so it would be a means via Congress to move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. There have been 2 bills that have been introduced that would essentially peel back the tax relief that rescheduling would provide. And so we recognize that one of the things that rescheduling would provide is IRS Code 280E would no longer be applicable. There have been 2 bills introduced in Congress that would essentially say, regardless of whether or not rescheduling are happening, you're still not getting that tax relief. There is a bill called the SHIP Act that would allow small cultivators and manufacturers to be able to ship their products directly to consumers via the mail once there was some form of legalization that would take place. There's also been an ongoing conversation and fight debate around hemp through different legislation being introduced in the last Congress, this Congress thus far. More recently, there has been the Hemp Act of 2025 that's been introduced that would create and amend the definition of hemp, create a regulatory framework, and try and close some of the loopholes related to intoxicating cannabinoids. There is a bill called the Prepare Act. It is a bill that would create a commission comprised of mostly federal agency heads, some private actors and citizens who participate in this commission as well. The point of this commission would be to make a recommendation for what a federal regulatory framework for cannabis should look like. There is the Evidence-Based Drug Policy Act. Currently, there is the Controlled Substances Act currently prevents the director of ONDCP, our Office of National Drug Control Policy, from spending any money studying the legalization of any Schedule I substance. We can't even study all this knowledge that we got up here earlier. Federal government, ONDCP, the entity that is responsible for our nation's national drug control strategy and that holds the purse strings for all of the agencies that support our national drug control strategy, they're not able, because of this provision in the CSA, to even study the legalization of any Schedule I substance. And they're required to oppose the legalization of any Schedule I substance. The Evidence-Based Drug Policy Act would remove those particular provisions that require them to oppose and prevent them from studying. And that's it. That's the federal cannabis.
Seems like it's just not going to be the big benefit that we were all hoping for. So can you kind of just bottom line everything for us from based on what's on the horizon, what's the best case scenario?
I mean, that we see some real leadership out of the folks in Washington, both in the executive branch and the legislature. I think the reality is that the folks who are doing this at the state and local level, they're doing the hard work. The federal government doesn't have to do everything. They don't have to start from scratch. They actually should be studying and learning from what's happening. I don't want to dismiss what is in reality a very complex situation that is this ecosystem and all the challenges and stakeholders that are involved in the process, but we need to figure out something that's actually going to at least begin to address those challenges, and rescheduling ain't it. And so I think that we have to rely on Congress. I do think that this president, through his executive authority, can play a huge role in charting our path for Congress, trying to identify some priorities, getting agencies to actually come on board. But we need law change. We need legal change. This is not just regulatory change. I actually think that the CSA is not the appropriate vehicle for us to be dealing with, 2025 and beyond cannabis issues. Cannabis was put on the Controlled Substances Act because a guy named Harry Anslinger had thought that cannabis was going to make white women sleep with black men, and he had a real concern about black folks in this country and recognized that this was needs to criminalize. This is something that was sustained through President Nixon. What the HHS recommendation didn't reveal, and what this rescheduling process doesn't even account for, is the fact that there was a whole commission already, the Shaker Commission, back in the day, that was a part of the original CSA. The original Controlled Substances Act required a study on marijuana and other drugs that was appointed by Nixon. And that Nixon commission recommended that marijuana at the time be descheduled, be decriminalized for personal use. And they completely disregarded that recommendation because it did not fit at the time with President Nixon's political ambitions. And history happens to repeat itself if we don't learn from it. And so I think we need to learn from history. I think we need to, address the challenges that are historic and present. And again, there are folks that are willing to do that work. Like the government, I don't know if it's like, it's too much. It's people are ready to do that work. That work needs to be done. And I think that the challenge that I've seen over the course of the last, 3 years since I've been in federal advocacy is that we're not focused on the ecosystem.